We have climate change, we have questions of poverty, how to house people, how to feed people. I think that technology will be a tool that helps us. But the most important thing here isn't the technology that we will put in place to solve these questions. It's more about how people will come together and work together.
Welcome to Smart City Talks, the Smart City Institute podcast. The SCI is the research center dedicated to the management of sustainable and smart territories at HEC Liège, the management school of the University of Liège. In this episode, Pauline, communication officer at the Smart City Institute, talks with Jessica Clement, researcher at CIRAD in France. But before joining CIRAD, Jessica worked as a researcher at the SCI for 4 years. Her fields of expertise: smart city governance, and more specifically collaboration between stakeholders, as well as issues related to sustainability. Jessica has also worked on the topic of just transition. The conversation you are about to hear is based on several articles she co-authored with Professor Nathalie Krudzen, academic director and founder of the Smart City Institute. With Jessica, we will focus on two main questions. How, in practice, are the concept of smart city and sustainability linked, based, among other things, on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals? And how can we improve collaboration between players in the smart city, taking the city of Toronto as an example? And to kick off the conversation, as she did with Giovanni in the first episode, Pauline asked Jessica an essential question. What is a smart city, in your opinion?
So for me, it's important to note that a smart city does not necessarily have to have a link with technology or digitalization. It can, but it's not a key component. What a smart city means for me is more about how people come together in a city or even a smaller area like a town or another locality and work together in an intelligent way to solve sustainability-related questions.
Okay, so what motivates you or excites you about the topic of smart cities?
So why I have really loved working on this topic is that when we look at the world today, we have so many challenges. We have climate change, we have questions of poverty, how to house people, how to feed people. And I think that to solve these questions, technology is very important and that it will be a tool that helps us. But the most important thing here isn't the technology that we will put in place to solve these questions. It's more about how people will come together and work together with or without this technology to support transitions to a more sustainable place, a more sustainable situation. And the smart city, at least in the way that I am defining it and working with it, is at the core of this question and this problem.
And while exploring the collaborative aspect of smart city, one thing struck Jessica.
So there's one thing that has been really interesting and surprising to me, and that's how much language or the way in which we say something matters. So I'm not talking about French or English, but I'm talking about vocabulary used, how we phrase things. And this is interesting because two people or two organizations could be saying the same thing. They have the same objectives, the same goals, but they talk about it in such a different way that at first it can look like it's not compatible. But once you start to talk more in a common language, we can see how shared goals emerge. And I think this is really interesting for collaboration and also for advancing on really complex questions relating to sustainability transitions.
The observation made by Jessica can be applied to the term smart city. At the Institute, we often see that the term is not always understood in the same way by different territorial actors. Some believe that smart city is only a question of technology. However, upon further examination, it quickly becomes apparent that it's more complex than that. And in this context, collaborations can help to smooth out the differences between stakeholders, as Jessica explains.
So one of the biggest challenges that has emerged from my research is getting people around the table together to talk about things in the same way. But it's also even deeper than that. It's about finding compromises, how to navigate trade-offs, finding ways to negotiate together in order to advance with many stakeholders together towards an end objective. And this is really difficult because each stakeholder is going to have their priorities, they're going to have their ways of seeing the world.
But before diving into the issue of collaboration, there is one paper we need to discuss. In this research focused on sustainable transition, Jessica and her colleagues identify a very clear link between the SDGs and smart city strategies. This highlights the sustainable aspect, which can be summed up in a term that Pauline spotted in the first article: the smart sustainable city.
That term immediately resonated with me because it highlights the sustainable transition process, which isn't always clearly understood, I think. So can you explain why this term appears in the scientific literature and what does it allow in your opinion?
Yes. So the smart city concept has been called very fuzzy, or there's a lot of different ways of understanding it. And this is certainly reflected in the literature. I think in very recent years, we're starting to converge on a more common idea of the smart city. But in earlier works, 10, 15 years ago, the smart city was often referred to in a technological way. But as the concept progressed, there was also this notion that, wait, why are we using this technology? It's for transformation of a city to meet certain objectives, and one of which, probably in my opinion, the most important, is sustainability. So you had these kind of two different approaches going along in the literature. And in order to clarify what a researcher is working on, that is a smart city that takes into consideration these sustainability questions, this term sustainable smart city emerged. For me, it's important to use this term in certain contexts because I want to put the emphasis on the fact that for our work, we are talking about a smart city that has the sustainability element, and that is a core component of the smart city for us.
You co-authored a paper that focused on the localization of the SDGs through smart city strategies. We all know the SDGs. These are the Sustainable Development Goals defined by the United Nations. But what do you mean by localization? Can you explain?
Yes, I will use my own words since I'm not sure I remember the very technical definition. But the SDGs are a framework that's been widely adopted, but originally it was conceived at a more national level. And so we have these 17 SDG goals that are applied to national policy frameworks, national objectives, and things like that. However, we see more and more that to address sustainability challenges, we have to go down to a local level. And here, the objective might be the same, but the way in which we reach this objective is going to be very different. It's also important to note at this time that we have these 17 goals, but they are rather broad. They're overarching objectives. And alongside, or within rather, these 17 SDGs, there are also sub-goals or targets. And there are 169 of them. So there are very many of them. But of course, for a local context, all of these 169 targets are not going to be applicable. So localization is also about finding which targets are most appropriate for the local context and then how to put these in place, all within this idea that the end objective is still toward achieving the SDGs at a more global level, but through bottom-up actions.
This principle of localization echoes the idea that Giovanni discussed in the first episode. One size does not fit all.
Well, the local level is, in my opinion, important to study because context matters so much. You could have two, on paper, very similar cities, similar population, similar demographics, similar GDP. But in reality, the two cities have different flavors, different characteristics. They work in a different way. And so one solution is not going to work for all of the cities, even if they look like they are similar. So this idea to bring it down to the local level is important because if we want to put in place policies, frameworks, initiatives, and actions that support transitions, they have to speak to the local characteristics of a city or a smaller town or neighborhood. And the SMART strategy is useful for this, especially if it starts to look at a more contextualized approach, because it is putting the end objectives or the ambitions of a city or town on paper. And this is useful because, one, it's a document that can be referred to, and it's also a way to engage different stakeholders, because once you have something that details all of these different steps and objectives, a government can say, hey, this is really appropriate for the private sector, or this might be more appropriate for a citizen initiative. And they can bring all of these people together based on the shared document that they created for the smart city transition.
And to carry out this research project, Jessica and her colleagues extracted data from no fewer than 57 smart city strategies from 29 different countries.
I think it is a lot. We tried our best to find as many strategies as possible, but it's important to note that I didn't do this alone. I worked in a team with Benoit and Natalie, and we helped each other out and we worked on this together.
Nice. Okay. So beyond the volume of data, what's also interesting is that you didn't just look at each SDG individually, you also examined the sub-themes they include. Can you tell us more about how you organized your results?
Yes. So maybe the boring details was that we just created some sort of Excel sheet where we had all of the goals and the targets, and we read through each strategy to see if one of these targets corresponded to text within the strategy document. So this is a bit how we organized it. Then we tried to understand the percentage of strategies that would have a certain target. And once we added these all up, we were able to see which goals emerged as the most prevalent amongst our data set of strategies. Mm-hmm. And the same for targets.
These results are summarized in a clear table that you can find in the article in question. And thanks to these data, the researchers were able to confirm, based on existing practices, that smart city strategies do indeed support sustainable transition. But what are the SDGs and sub-goals that are most commonly found in strategies they studied?
So we had 4 goals that emerged as rather prevalent across the different smart city strategies. The first is SDG 7. So this is on sustainable energy, affordable and clean energy. And this could be renewable energy or improving energy efficiency. So any initiative related to these objectives. The second goal that we found across the strategies was SDG 8. So this is on economic growth and also on good working conditions. So salary, safety, quality of life balance, things like this. And then after, which is kind of in the similar umbrella, we also found SDG 9, which is on innovation, industry, and infrastructure, to be also very common in the smart city strategy documents. And then finally, this is a more obvious one, SDG 11, which is on sustainable cities and communities. We found this to be overwhelmingly present in the different documents as well. So these 4 goals were rather prevalent. And then if we look more to a target level, we found certain targets that are focusing on participation across different actors and collaboration and partnerships as well.
So on the other side, are there any SDGs that are overlooked?
Yes. Well, let me start by saying that because local context is so important when developing a smart city strategy and approach, it's completely normal that cities in their strategy documents don't put everything, because a strategic document is supposed to reflect what priorities a city has and how they want to reach these priorities. So we don't expect for a document to include details about all 17 SDGs. However, that being said, across our sample, there were very few strategies that talked about equity, so gender as well as other types of equity. Mm-hmm. And also we saw that when we look at the environmental topic of sustainability, there were few strategies that talked about biodiversity. I think for some of the questions, like the question about equity, it is important to consider this, because when you're trying to have a systematic transition that involves a lot of moving parts, a lot of actors, you have to balance some of the goals related to economic efficiency or technology or development or even environmental goals with this question of equality. Also in the strategic documents to manage and steer this transition in a balanced way and in a way that is fair for all of the citizens.
A first recommendation for local authorities is emerging. Pay attention to those underrepresented SDGs, if these are relevant to local realities, of course. But Jessica has other recommendation for us.
I think first, having a strategy document is helpful because we've already touched on this before, but it puts an overarching vision on paper that all different stakeholders and actors can relate to. And two, it helps pull out different priorities that may correspond also with the achievement of the SDGs. It is important also when we're creating these documents or going through these processes, rather, not just the document, but the entire process around creating a strategy, the engagement for it, and also the implementation after, to have in mind how to balance all of these ambitions with questions of equity, inclusion going forward, to make sure that this is done in a way that supports all of the different citizens.
Smart city strategies can be a key factor in achieving the SDGs. But in another study, Jessica and her colleagues demonstrated that these strategies, or strategizing for smart cities, can also promote another pillar that is very important in the smart city transition: the collaboration between the different stakeholders, starting with government, the private sector, research institutions, and citizens.
We already see that there are many actors involved, and also that they could have very different skills, competencies, priorities, ways of seeing the world, ways of addressing problems. And so if you have this common vision at the end, which is to have a sustainable transformation of the city, it would be very difficult for all of these different people or actors to get to the same end desired point without collaboration. Mm-hmm. And another point here is that these transitions are very complex. They're about sustainability, they're about the environment, they're about the climate, they're about biodiversity, they're about equality, they're about transport, they're about the way in which a city is organized, how it's managed. And this complexity benefits greatly from different skills and different points of views. And in order to benefit from all of these potential resources, collaboration is essential.
So understanding which factors influence collaboration is essential to ensure the performance of smart city dynamics. And it makes sense. But what are those factors exactly?
So for this particular work, we looked at a series of different factors. We looked at if a city or a town had a smart city strategy. We also considered the role of smart city managers. We considered the size of the smart city ecosystem. And then we looked at some indicators that help describe the context of the smart city.
And what were your conclusions regarding each of the three factors studied? Can municipalities actually act on them to foster collaborations with the ecosystem?
Yes. So one of probably the most important finding from this study is that we saw, despite differences in municipalities, that having a smart city strategy supported collaboration amongst the different stakeholders. This was a rather general and strong finding across the sample that we had. We also saw something interesting related to size. So when a city or a municipality is very small, as it grows, there's more collaboration. And this is because if you're a very small town and you have a local problem, you might be able to solve it with just a couple of the stakeholders around. You don't need to have advice from 5 different research institutes and 10 different private companies. Mm-hmm. The scale is smaller, and so you collaborate with fewer people to reach your objectives. As a town, municipality, city grows, collaboration grows with it up to a certain point. And this point where it starts to then decrease reflects the complexity in collaborating with many different stakeholders. Mm-hmm. And we found in our study that in order to support collaboration, even as a city gets larger and larger and larger, to manage this complexity, it was beneficial to have a dedicated smart city manager because it was their role to make sure the different stakeholders or actors collaborate together, everyone is heard, and to solve solutions in this collaborative manner. So the strategy was really key.
The question then becomes, can these configurations be generalized to all local governments? And the answer found by their research is clear. Evidence shows that for fruitful collaboration, a smart city strategy is a key factor in any situation.
So we have just talked about collaborations between actors or stakeholders in a broad sense. In the last paper I wanted to discuss with you in this episode, we dive into a very concrete form of collaboration, focusing on a specific case, the PPPs. So to make sure we are all on the same page, can you explain what a PPP is?
Yes. So a PPP, it stands for public-private partnership. There's a wealth of literature that could go into different types of PPP, but for today's purposes, what it means is that you're going to have the private sector in collaboration through a contract or an agreement of some sorts with the private sector to deliver a service or an infrastructure, roads or buildings or something like that. So it's the public and private sector working together to deliver a service or an infrastructure.
Okay, so here it involves both the public and the private sectors. But in your paper, you draw attention to the importance of including a third actor, the citizen. Why is it essential to include them when talking about PPPs, and what should we be mindful of?
So I think it's good to take a small step back and talk about why we have PPPs. One key reason why PPPs are a popular model is because we've already talked about how transitioning cities or municipalities is not very easy. There are a lot of challenges now that we face. These are complex activities, they're complex transitions, and they require a lot of resources, financial resources, but also intelligence resources as well. And it is very unlikely that the governments or public sector will be able to do this without help. And the private sector exists. They have funding. They have models that have a solid business model behind it that allows them to deliver something and still make a profit. They're efficient, and they also have a lot of know-how. And so the idea that we can put public needs to deliver something to the citizens alongside the private sector with resources and a certain amount of efficiency to make sure that this actually gets delivered in practice is important given the current state of things right now. So this is one reason why PPPs are talked about a lot. But PPPs often face difficulties. They're not always very smooth processes. And one thing that we find from both what we can read in the news, but also in the literature, is that there can sometimes be tensions between PPP projects and citizens. And this is because, especially at a local level, the projects might consider the end goal, such as delivering a service in an efficient way, but they might not consider how the process of doing this affects the life of citizens on the ground, how it affects their daily life. And if this aspect isn't considered, there will be disputes between the different partners and the citizens. There will be tensions, and the project can even fail if the citizen interests are not represented.
And in this article, you, with Nathalie, you had the idea to analyze two concrete projects carried out in Toronto, Canada, your home country, right?
Yes.
How did you end up choosing these two cases?
Yes, so we chose two cases. Well, first we wanted to have a similar context, similar institutions, similar cultures, similar environment factors, things like that. And so we wanted to narrow our focus just to one city. So we looked for projects that were happening in the same area. Mm-hmm. And admittedly, one of them has gotten a lot of attention in the media. So it was an interesting case to study. And then we found a second one to kind of show the flip side of things. So the first project is world known, probably by now. It's a project for developing a part of the waterfront area in Toronto. The project itself was, at this time, it's since changed, but at this time it was run by Sidewalk Labs, which is a company that at the time was under Alphabet or a Google in this ecosystem. And they were doing the project Sidewalk Toronto. I'm leaving out a lot of details, but just to get to the core of it. And this project was a partnership between Public Body in Toronto and this Sidewalk Labs company. And they put out this beautiful plan on paper to develop a part of the waterfront. It looked great. It was sustainable. It was clean. It was efficient. It was beautiful. But the problem was that this plan wasn't backed for a few reasons by a set of citizens in Toronto. So there were some sustainability questions about water resources and wildlife around the area. But another key point was about data use and data protection. And essentially this vision that Sidewalk Toronto had within it was dependent on the use of personal data. And the confusing part here was that it wasn't just users of the city, it's citizens at this point. And they were implicated in this development of this area. And there were groups of citizens that were really not okay with this approach. They also tried to have public consultations with the company and the citizens to try and resolve some of these questions. But the citizens felt like they were not being heard. That company came, and even if they were discussing things, they had already made up their mind behind the scenes. I could go into a lot more detail, but that's the gist of it, that they had this really beautiful plan on paper that ultimately didn't work at the end because it ignored certain citizen priorities and preferences, notably in this case with respect to data. And the project failed.
Okay, we're starting to see why it's important to involve citizens in PPPs. So the case Jessica just mentioned didn't succeed. But the other case they studied, Regent Park, did work. So what made the difference?
So the first point is that we talked with several different experts for the two cases, and given their perspective, none of the cases were either a complete success or a complete failure. So just to nuance that a little bit, but for our research purposes, we consider a best practice case that, in our view, was successful because it was a public-private partnership that included citizens, and they ended up advancing on key development objectives that I can go into detail in a little bit. So the best practice case that we studied was a neighborhood that had to be revitalized because it was having issues related to crime, cleanliness. Also, the buildings were in a bad state, and there was a private company that came in to support this revitalization process in the neighborhood. And what made this successful, or some key factors that we found that made this PPP successful, was the fact that the private company, and especially a few key employees, were very present on the ground. They would go visit the neighborhoods, they would discuss with the residents, they would try to understand their point of view, speak the same language, and identify the priorities of the different residents. And this was an iterative process. It took a long time to reach this, to build up trust, and to really achieve this level of collaboration between the private company and the citizens. Something that we saw in this case that was really interesting is that there would be key strategic documents or plans that were made to guide the development of Regent Park. But along the way, they realized, the citizens and the company together, that maybe it was missing something or they needed to do something differently. And the citizens would say, hey, listen, actually, this area here, we could use it for sports because we don't have any sports facilities. And even if it wasn't in the original plan, the private company was like, okay, we can do that. We understand that's a priority for you. Let's make it work. And so there was this rapport that was built up between the residents and the company over time that really allowed a level of collaboration that was effective and resulted in successful outcomes.
So it's not just listening to people, it's also the ability to change the plans.
Exactly.
One thing that's clear in this research is that the public sector, for example cities, municipalities, etc., must play a pivotal role in preserving relations between the private sector on one hand and civil society on the other. A bit like a conductor. So, does Jessica have any recommendations for municipalities that would like to put all of this into practice on their territory?
So we found, and what I think personally, based off the research that I've done, that strategic documents are indeed extremely important. They do a number of things for collaboration. It should be noted that even creating this document would benefit from co-creation or collaboration with citizens. We're not just talking about one point in time, but an entire process. So engaging in these sorts of activities. Also, what we learned from the most recent research that we discussed is that the local government has an important role to make sure that the private actors it engages to help realize these strategies have shared objectives in mind with the citizens and also the government. Obviously, profit is important. They wouldn't engage in a project if it wasn't profitable, but there have to be other shared objectives that go beyond just the private sector making money. So improving well-being, sustainability objectives, something like that. And so these are already two key things that governments can do that can support not just the transformation of their area, but to ensure that collaboration helps underpin this transition along the way.
To sum up, create a clear strategic document in collaboration with other stakeholders and making sure the objectives of the different stakeholders are aligned as much as possible.
Thank you, Jessica, for this enriching conversation. I think you have given us plenty of insights to help us think about and manage our territories in a more sustainable and collaborative way.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
If you'd like to explore a bit more the research conducted by Jessica and the Smart City Institute, you can visit our website at www.smartcityinstitute.be. You will find all our tools and publications, including our Smart City practical guides and much more to inspire your own Smart City reflections. All resources mentioned are accessible in the link provided in the episode description. And finally, to stay up to date with our latest news, join us on social media.